So today I want to talk about my ministry history. It's been close to 30 years since I entered the church ministry. And during this period, I've had my share of disappointment, disillusionment, and failures in ministry. Fresh off from seminary, I was young and full of energy, full of fire, full of passion, full of dreams, ready to take the word and ready to change the world, or at least try. My first ministry placement was a part-time youth ministry, which only lasted 1 year. But that didn't deter me. Soon I was hired as a full-time associate minister of a Korean church ministering to second-generation Korean Canadians. And it started out really well for about 1 year. And then all hell broke loose in the church. The congregation split in half. The one group of the side of us went to the senior minister and the other group against him, and for and against. And very soon friends became enemies. The church board meetings turned into political posturing. Fellowship coffee hours became gossiping and recruiting ground. And soon accusations, judgment, finger pointing, and even shouting matches were happening among the members on Sundays during and after the services. It was ugly. The conflict escalated into a crisis and then into full-blown chaos. Now, I didn't know what to do. I felt totally helpless, caught in between fights. And I thought church was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a battleground. I thought church people were supposed to be nice to each other, not so nasty. I thought they were supposed to love each other, not hate so much. Well, I was young and naive. Meanwhile, both sides wanted me to take their side and try to recruit me to their side. And I said no, which was not a wise thing to do. You see, under the circumstances like that, you need to take side if you want to survive. But I didn't believe in taking sides. So they both excluded me and set me aside, and I was all alone, isolated, and a stranger in my own church. Our church eventually split in half. The senior minister took half of the congregation and planted a new church outside. And the remainder of the congregation stayed in the church building and hired a Korean minister who was there on a student working visa. Me, I quit. All along, I believed I would resign when things settled down. So I did. But I didn't prepare for my next ministry placement before I resigned, which was not a wise thing to do. Well, I was young and naive. I believed that God would provide. But once I quit, I had no place to go, no money in the bank, barely surviving. On top of that, God gave me a gift. I became a diabetic. Stress and all that. So that was the first 5 years of my ministry life. Great start, right? At that point, I felt totally disillusioned with church ministry. I felt dried up, cut off, and utterly hopeless. I felt like a major failure. Have you ever felt dried up, cut off, and even hopeless? Everywhere you turn, there seems to be no way up, no way out, no way back, in the pit of darkness, feeling like you are sitting in the middle of dump, in the middle of a valley of dry bones. The Israelites cried out to God, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, and we are cut off completely." So in our Bible text for today is from the book of Ezekiel. It's the well-known text on the vision of the valley of dry bones. But the first things first, historical background. The Babylonian kingdom, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded the Israelites, conquered, destroyed land, and captured many of them to the land of Babylon, including the prophet Ezekiel. So Israelites were in exile, homeless, hopeless, and helpless, and they cried out to God, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, and we are cut off completely." dried up, cut off, and utterly hopeless, in total desperation. So back to my ministry story. So after I resigned from my previous church, I went on a retreat, 7 days silent retreat at a Jesuit retreat center. I was searching and wanted to know what God had in mind for me, for my ministry. And a few days later, after I returned from the retreat, I got a call from a church in Hobbema Indian Reserve in Alberta. They wanted me to come for an interview to be their church minister. So I thought, maybe God is listening to my prayer after all. Well, you see, that church was one of many churches I applied for ministry position and the only one who responded to my application. Well, in fact, it was the last church I applied after sending my resume to over, I think, about 50 churches, and I got no answer from any of them. And I found out about this church by accident. I happened to flip over the United Church Observer magazine, and it had a whole back cover advertising their ministry position, which caught my eyes and my interest. So I applied. Not even a week after a week, they called me back. And I thought that was quick, and thought God must have a plan for me. Thank you, God. Now, looking back, I should have known how desperate they were trying to find a minister. I'm putting ads on the back cover of the magazine. I mean, not unless you are desperate, right? But no one was responding to their call except me. How lucky I was. I should have known. But then I was young, naive, and desperate. Not a good combination. Of course, I really believed God planned it all along, because as what we say, God works in a mysterious way. Well, by the way, I still believe in that. Now, I had no idea about the Indian Reserve, their history, their quality of life, the people and the location and the land. No idea whatsoever before I went there. I imagine a church in some rural prairie town, in a farming town, surrounded by nice farming houses, a little church house on a prairie, sort of that idea. Well, nothing like that. The church was in the smack center of Indian Reserve town, surrounded by rows and rows of rundown houses. Streets were littered with piles of garbage, potholes everywhere, and most people I saw on that streets on that day were walking a bit funny. The place reminded me of Vancouver East Hastings streets in any given day. Now, shocking. Well, that was the first impression. Remember, I was still young and naive. I mean, what did I know back then? Of course, my view about the place and the people has changed a lot later. Like my view of Vancouver East Hastings Street has changed a lot since I first visited there. But it was shocking at first. And I said to myself, what? Oh my God, I don't want to be here. God, are you kidding me? And God seems to say, no, I am not. And I said, God, this is not what I wanted. I thought you were going to let me out of valley of dry bones, not leading me to another valley of dry bones. You gotta be kidding me, God. This is not even funny. And God says, Richard, I am not kidding. You wait and see. It's different. That's kind of sort of conversation I had in my head. So I said, well, okay, it better be. So I decided to answer God's call to minister in a First Nations church in Indian Reserve. I mean, imagine the shock my wife Sue had when she landed there later. Yeah, I know. So that's my connection with Indian Reserve, my ministry there. In a valley of dry bones, I cried out to God, and God brought me out of my misery and settled me into yet another valley of dry bones. What? I tell you, God has a sense of humor and mysterious in many ways. Now, before I forget, I'm hoping that when I say dry bones, I don't literally mean dry bones. It's just a figure of speech, a metaphor. I know that you understand, but just in case some of you thought, what, there's a valley of dry bones there? No, folks, no. Figure of speech, okay? Just wanted to let you know, remind ourselves. So I said, God, look at these people. They are in a valley of dry bones. They are dry bones. And you led me here? And God seems to say, Richard, you thought you were in a valley of dry bones? You haven't seen nothing yet. Now, before I go any further with my story, a reminder, one more reminder, folks. Now, when I talk about my experiences, I am not retelling exactly what happened. I mean, what's fun in that, right? Like Bible writers, when they retell the events of the past, they always ad-lib their experience by integrating their own context and perspective. That's how they engaged with the past events and truth, and that's how I interact with my past events. It's more like a theological reflection than just a news report. Okay, folks? So, God led me to that church through the valley of dry bones and set me right in the middle. God set me in the middle of generations of desperation, brokenness, and tragedies, and tears, and oppressions. Generations of First Nations people who were exiled in their own land. And there, God gradually brought me out of my own misery and brokenness, out of my valley of dry bones, as I witnessed the scope and the depth of pains and brokenness these people were going through for generations, but still surviving, still able to laugh, still willing to welcome and accept the outsiders like me. The ministry with the First Nations people there has opened my eyes to see the true misery and suffering, and it broke open my heart. In 2014, after 5 years of hard work, the Indian Residential School Truth and Reconciliation Commission had its last national gathering in Edmonton, just 1 hour north of Hobima, where I ministered. Many survivors of the Indian Residential School got the chance to share their stories, and many others gathered to listen and learn. Many tears shed, many painful stories shared and heard, much guilt and anger, shame and sadness experienced. And remember, a week before the Truth and Reconciliation meeting, and remember reading a newspaper, I was in Kelowna at the time, reading a newspaper that 3 women committed suicide in 1 week in that town. And I thought, we still have a long way to go. Nothing has changed much. Nothing will change anytime soon. Still a long way to go, even with all this truth and reconciliation stuff. I thought I was dried up. No, they were dried up. The Israelites felt totally dried up, cut off, and hopeless in their exile. There was no way up from where they were, no way out, no way back from the land of exile to their homeland. But then, as always, God comes along and gives them a second chance. God calls his servant Ezekiel and shows him a vision. The prophet Ezekiel is taken to a valley, into the pit of the valley of dry bones, and God says, these bones are the whole house of Israelite. Can these dry bones live? And God commands Ezekiel, prophecy to the dry bones. And when Ezekiel speaks God's word, the dry bones come back to life. They were put together, clothed with a new flesh, muscles and organs and skins and hairs and blood flowing through the veins, completely reclothed with a new body. And then God breathed God's spirit into the bodies, and then the new life emerged from the dead. The pile of dry bones is transformed into a group of mighty, strong warriors, ready to fight and conquer. And God says, this is what I will do to the house of Israel. I will bring them up from their graves. I will bring them out of their exile. I will bring them back to their homeland. I will do all this, and they will know that I am their God. Can these dry bones live? Oh, yes, God, you know. May 5th, 2 weeks ago, was a red dress day. Pacific Mountain region of United Church of Canada had a town hall meeting on that day. And this is what they said, their statement. Friends, we commemorate the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people who have been lost in our community. We look to our history, the decisions and catalysts that have created the inequalities Indigenous people face today. As we seek to rectify our relationships and reconcile with our Indigenous neighbors in the calls to action and the calls to the church, we share a space with Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people who have suffered and continue to suffer by remembering their lives and pledging to do better in our work to help them find equality and justice. So I joined the meeting through Zoom, virtually. It was great to see Indigenous ministers and leaders from many places leading the service, even a minister from Morley, Alberta. I remember hearing about John Snow, a minister there when I ministered Hobbema over 20 years ago. We have come a long way since we began the work of healing with Indigenous brothers and sisters. This meeting and many meetings like that is just a step toward the path to healing and reconciliation for both Indigenous people and for the rest of us Canadians. This is a step out of a valley of dry bones for both, for the Indigenous people from the generations of oppressions that they have suffered, and for the rest of Canadians, especially the churches, from our own valley of dry bones, from our greed and sins as occupiers and oppressors. We both need revival and renewal and out of our misery. Well, let's get back to my story, wrap it up. Out of brokenness and failure, God called me into a ministry toward the broken people of Indian Reserve, Hobbema. And there God changed me inside and out and breathed a new call into ministry. It was the most challenging and rewarding time in my ministry and my life. God brought a new life into my dry soul. So fast forward 20 years later, present time. 3 years ago, God led me to Knox, the promised land, the valley of treasures, yes. Well, not so fast, folks. You all know that treasures are usually hidden in the valley of dry bones, right? When you watch Indiana Jones and the other treasure hunt movies, the treasures are almost always hidden in some valleys among the ruins and dry bones with snakes and poisonous reptiles and dangers everywhere. So I ended up in the valley of Kitsilano, a valley of treasures among dry bones. And yes, we are getting dry, literally. As I get older, I feel my body getting weaker and my bones getting drier. And most of us in Knox family are not getting any younger. Our bodies getting weaker and our bones getting drier, and very soon we will all end up in a valley of dry bones, literally. But that's not all that bad. It's called reality. We've got to all face our mortality sooner or later. But you see, God is breathing life into this valley of dry bones, into this church. Our spirit is getting revived every day. God is breathing the spirit of revival to each one of us here at Knox and to the church. We are being revived with our vision for ministry, for our neighbors, for the world. You see, later, we will get together later today after the church and our fellowship time to hear our building committee's report on the building update. And it's almost here, folks. Our vision that we have prayed and dreamed for years of becoming reality soon and very soon. Our physical bones might get drier, but God is reviving our spirit. And the vision for the world, our neighbors, yes, the damn bones are coming back to life here at Knox. God says to the church, to us, to the world, can these dry bones live? Of course, God will bring life into these dry bones. Because that's what God does, giving second chances, bringing life into a lifeless body, bringing hope into a hopeless people, breathing a new spirit into weary and broken souls, turning our mourning into dancing, our grief into joy, our brokenness into blessing, our failures into steps of fruitfulness and faithfulness. Can these dry bones live? Of course. God will never abandon his church. God will never abandon us, God's people. God will and is bringing back the church. God says, I will bring back the Israelites. And God says, I will bring back the church. We are at the cusp of God's renewal, revival, and restoration. God is pouring out the spirit of revival to the church, to each one of us, to our dry souls. Can these dry bones live? Of course, Lord, you know.